Breaking news this Monday night, murderous accusation. Why Canada suspects India is behind the killing of this Canadian man in BC.
It is outrageous, it is shocking.
The push to lower food prices, the federal government's promise, and why one grocery exec says the problem is complicated. A sharp rise in violent shoplifters.
The girl turned around and beat me up.
Why thieves are becoming more brazen. Plus, progress and powering forward.
Women's dreams are going to come true.
A hockey league for women to call their own.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with allegations of a grave violation of Canadian sovereignty. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada's security intelligence agencies suspect the Indian government is behind the murder of a Canadian man on Canadian soil. Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a prominent Sikh leader, was shot and killed by two masked gunmen outside a Sikh temple in Surrey, BC in June. He was a vocal advocate for the creation of a separate state for Sikh people in India, where they are a religious minority. India's Hindu nationalist prime minister has denounced that idea and declared Nijjar a terrorist. Today, news that India may have had a hand in his murder was met with outrage by all political leaders in Ottawa.
Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen.
If these allegations are true, they represent an outrageous affront to Canada's sovereignty.
To hear the Prime Minister of Canada corroborate a potential link between a murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil by a foreign government is something I could never have imagined.
With me is our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, Canada accusing the Indian government of executing a Canadian citizen doesn't get more serious. What do we know about the investigation right now and the intelligence?
Well, Donna, it's really an extraordinary and highly unusual allegation, obviously, and we don't know very much about what actually led the Canadian government and officials to determine that they believe they have what the Prime Minister called credible intelligence that agents of India's intelligence agency were behind this murder, this essentially political assassination is what they are alleging. We know that there certainly would have been national security agencies involved in this, but we also know that it's primarily still a murder investigation. This is somebody who was killed, and the RCMP have been looking into that, and it's during the course of that investigation, in part, that we're hearing this started to evolve. But we still really don't have any details on, for example, who exactly ordered this hit, or who was responsible, the government believes, for pulling the trigger. And of course, there are calls to hold those individuals responsible. All of this tells us a little bit about the icy feeling that we felt from Justin Trudeau and Prime Minister Modi when the Prime Minister was in India recently. He says that he confronted Prime Minister Modi very directly in no uncertain terms about this. It is highly unusual for another G7 country and for a democracy to take this kind of extrajudicial action and killing on an ally's territory. So it's a pretty extraordinary day in Canadian history.
Mercedes, what is Canada doing to try to get cooperation and get answers from the Indian government?
Well, they're certainly calling on the Indian government, Donna, to answer questions. Whether or not they'll admit to the allegations the Prime Minister has made is an interesting question. But at this point, what we do know the Canadian government done is to have expelled a top Indian diplomat. It is a man by the name of Pavan Kumar Rai, and he was the head of the Indian Intelligence Service here in Canada. It's known as the Research and Analysis Wing. It's like India's CIA. So he is out of the country at this point. Here's what Minister Jolie had to say about that.
We expect India's full collaboration to make sure that we get to the bottom of this. And as of today, and as a consequence, we've expelled a top Indian diplomat from Canada.
This is now a very difficult situation for the Trudeau government because they were hoping to shift the relationship, which is soured with China, to India, of course, the Indo-Pacific strategy, Donna, and all of that. And now, obviously, that is a very strained relationship, too.
All right, Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa, thanks. Well, before announcing that news about India, the Prime Minister and his cabinet were facing a barrage of questions about the soaring cost of living and the housing crisis. Plus, the CEOs of Canada's biggest grocery store chains were given a last-minute invitation to Ottawa. David Akin explains what they were there for.
What is your message going to be to the government today?
They came from Costco, Empire, Loblaw, Walmart, and Metro. CEOs of the country's largest grocers summoned to Ottawa.
Look forward to a productive meeting.
A meeting with senior members of the Trudeau cabinet.
Our government is going to do everything in our power to make sure prices stabilize.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne are looking for ways to lower food prices.
Bottom line is that they have agreed to support the Government of Canada in our efforts to stabilize food price in Canada.
But Champagne could not provide specifics about what that means or how prices could drop. And one of those grocery CEOs said after the meeting, high grocery prices were a complex problem with no easy fix.
It's an industry issue. Any conversation has to include all the manufacturers, producers, farmers, and everybody. It's not just about the retailers. The minister understands that very clearly.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Meanwhile, in the House of Commons, the opposition is impatient for solutions to high food prices.
When will the Prime Minister stop the delay and the disappointment? When will this government step up and force these CEOs to finally lower their prices?
And high housing prices.
It took him 8 years to cause this housing hell. How long will it take to fix it?
The Prime Minister tried to brush off the attacks.
Speaker, the opposition leaders' bickering won't help get houses built. Our plan does.
The latest inflation scorecard comes out Tuesday morning when Statistics Canada releases the Consumer Price Index for August. Bay Street forecasters believe the number will come in at about 4%. That's still too high and still driven by rising food prices. Donna.
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Those rising prices are believed to be part of the reason for an increase in shoplifting. From groceries to retail, theft is becoming more common, including incidents of violence. Mike Drolet reports.
Brazen, shockingly aggressive at times, and all caught on camera. As inflation rises historically, so too does theft. But retailers report they've never seen desperation quite like this.
There's a couple of guys videotaping. Wonderful.
Most companies now make it a policy. Don't engage. It's not worth it. Because as the Retail Council of Canada can attest, the front lines of business are getting dangerous.
Nowadays, we hear from retailers daily of incidents of violence and weapons being used in the commission of crime. If I go back 4 years, that might have occurred once a quarter where we heard of a serious incident.
Mass mob theft has become something of an epidemic in the US and the UK. Canada, it seems, isn't far behind. Chris Scholes and her mother Ursula have run Under the Bridge Fashions in Calgary since 2003. They say petty theft was always an issue, but they never felt unsafe until one day when Chris was tending to the store with her baby and 6 girls walked in.
I didn't know what was going on, and then I gave my daughter to this young lady and went out, called the cops, and the girl turned around and beat me up.
Police made an arrest, and the girl was eventually given community service. Frustrated and scared, they moved the store, and when Ursula had a similar incident at the new location, they moved again, this time to a mall with security just past the airport.
And just the approaches we've been taking just aren't working. They're not working.
Canadian Police Association President Tom Stamatakis is as frustrated as anyone. In March, Vancouver police arrested 217 people as part of a crackdown on theft. Combined, they had 4,695 prior convictions. Proof, he says, getting arrested isn't the deterrent it once was.
And they're getting more and more brazen because there's no reaction to it. There's no consequence. There's no fear of detection or any kind of a negative impact on the person as an individual.
Desperate times lead to desperate crimes. And right now it's retailers who are left holding an empty bag. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Tomorrow, Global National will explore how much retailers are losing to theft and what's being done to try to stop it. There were rallies across Canada today calling for landfill sites to be searched for the remains of missing Indigenous women.
Search that landfill and do it now.
People gathered in 17 cities to demand the Manitoba government reverse its decision not to search the Prairie Green landfill site. As Melissa Ridgen reports, the protests have reignited conversations about reconciliation and sparked calls for the search of other landfills.
The government owes it to its people to search the landfills.
A wave of red shirts and dresses made its way across the country today in solidarity.
Search the landfill! Search the landfill!
In July, Manitoba Premier Heather Stephenson said her Conservative government would not conduct a search for the remains of at least 3 murdered Indigenous women, saying it could take up to 3 years, cost up to $200 million, and it's too dangerous. But unions say that's not the case and came out today joining calls to look for the remains of Mercedes Myron, Morgan Harris, and an unidentified woman elders call Buffalo Woman.
We have members that do hazardous work across the country. We all know how to be safe when it comes to working with hazardous materials, so I don't buy that.
What began as a grassroots movement has become political in Manitoba in the midst of an election. Wab Canoe, a First Nations man, hopes to be the next premier and return the NDP to power after 7 years in opposition.
The NDP, I'm happy to say that have announced that they will search the landfill site if elected.
Stephenson is on the other side of the issue with those who believe a landfill search will cost too much and won't necessarily yield results. For missing and murdered advocates, no matter what the cost, it's worth trying to return these women to their families.
When our province of Manitoba's serial killer ends up passing away himself, he will be laid to rest on his terms. Those women don't get that.
Today's action has sparked conversations that other landfills may also need to be searched in pursuit of justice for missing or murdered Indigenous women. They hope this movement ends in results.
If your granddaughter or your daughter was sitting in a landfill and nobody wanted to look for her, what would you do? You'd be crying and fighting, and that's what we're doing.
Melissa Ridgen, Global News, Winnipeg.
The U.S. and Iran have freed 5 detainees, each in a controversial prisoner swap. The American men, some held for nearly a decade, were flown to Qatar and then on to the U.S. They were swapped for 5 Iranians held in the U.S. It happened after the Biden administration agreed to release $6 billion in Iranian oil money frozen under sanctions. Critics are blasting the deal, saying Iran will use the money to fund attacks against the U.S. and its allies. The Biden administration insists the money will be held in restricted accounts and only be used for things like food and medicine.
We're very confident that the funds, the Iranian funds that have been made more easily available to Iran as a result of the actions that we've taken will be used exclusively for humanitarian purposes, and we have the means and mechanisms to make sure that that happens.
After the swap, the U.S. imposed new sanctions on Iran, targeting organizations and individuals responsible for holding Americans captive. In Libya, there is growing anger in Derna a week after those 2 dams burst, flooding huge parts of the city. The water has receded, and outside a mosque, protesters demanded accountability for the dams that burst last week. They also called for national unity. The disaster has been blamed on Libya's rival governments. The country is fractured after years of conflict, and the infrastructure has been neglected. Officials are still trying to assess the scale of the destruction. The UN believes more than 11,000 people have died. That number is expected to rise. More than 10,000 people are still unaccounted for. Food safety concerns after Calgary's E. coli outbreak. Coming up, what advocates want to see changed across Canada. In Alberta, the NDP opposition is calling for a public inquiry into an E. coli outbreak that's now spread to at least 348 people. Health officials believe it's highly likely the source was a commercial kitchen used by a number of city daycares. 9 children are still in the hospital. 3 of them are on dialysis. As Heather Yurix-West explains, the outbreak has exposed gaps in food safety that need to be reviewed.
After 2 weeks at home, Farley Maxwell is getting set to go back to a daycare that nearly made him sick.
He is going tomorrow. I'm going to go on wait lists like everyone else.
With limited options for childcare, parents like Maxwell feel they have no choice but to send their kids back to the daycares where E. coli spread. 2 weeks later, with only a strong suspicion the source came from a shared kitchen, Alberta's opposition says it's time an independent inquiry is launched.
While public health does incredibly important work, there must be a focus on getting answers to the underlying cause of this crisis and the failure of the system to prevent it.
Alberta's premier says she agrees more answers are required in time.
I have committed to do a review. I'm not quite sure what form that will take just yet. I want to make sure that we've gotten through the worst of the crisis.
Food handling and safety rules for childcare centres vary across the country, but in almost every jurisdiction, there appears room to improve.
I think that food the policy around it is not strong in Canada. And I think that the food handling is one important piece of food policy. So that's what I think about it. I think they should all be reviewed in detail.
Show me a trick.
For this mom, the path forward must include tougher penalties when food safety rules aren't followed.
Something to really, again, put the fear of God into people running these kinds of operations and making sure that they stick to those guidelines because it puts people's lives at risk.
And as the outbreak in Calgary illustrates, a single kitchen can lead to major fears about people becoming sick. Heather Urex West, Global News, Calgary.
American auto workers have walked off the job. Ahead, anxiety their Canadian counterparts are about to follow them. "5,000 workers at Ford automotive plants in Ontario are preparing to walk off the job. Their contract expires at midnight tonight. If they do, it will send a shock through the vehicle manufacturing industry, already hit hard by an unprecedented strike in the U.S. Turia Isri looks at what it could all mean for consumers.
In the summer of the strike, the latest labor dispute is unfolding on both sides of the border.
We're dealing with a bunch of billionaires. They don't care about us.
American employees at the big three automakers, GM, Stellantis, and Ford, have been on strike since last week. And they could soon be joined by 5,000 Canadian workers. The union that represents them is in talks with Ford, but says both sides are far apart.
Down with the bosses!
The NDP insists it's part of a trend across the country.
With the cost of inflation going up, with companies making huge profits, we deserve our fair share.
Unifor is negotiating with Ford on a deal that could become a blueprint for workers at GM and Stellantis. The union wants better pensions and higher wages as the industry embarks on an electric vehicle revolution.
They're in the middle of making huge investments and changes to transition. And the strike is coming right bang in the middle of this transition.
That transition includes multi-billion-dollar subsidies from the federal government.
Well, obviously we're watching, but as you know, you see that on both sides of the border, that you say an action on one side have an impact on both sides.
The strike in the U.S. is already threatening to disrupt Canadian production.
They're very deeply intertwined. Almost any vehicle assembled on one side of the border or the other is getting components.
The automotive sector has not fully recovered from the pandemic. So there are concerns that if strikes drag on, it will only add to supply chain issues and make it even harder to buy a new car in Canada. Turia Isri, Global News, Ottawa.
Next, how the new Professional Women's Hockey League is shifting the sports culture.
With the first overall pick in the inaugural Professional Women's Hockey League draft, Minnesota selects Taylor Heisey.
Dreams came true for lots of women today as the PWHL held its first draft before the start of its inaugural season in January. There have been other women's hockey leagues, but this one is launching during a surge of interest in women's sports around the world. Eric Sorensen looks at how the new league could set the bar for hockey's next generation of players.
Jocelyn Larocque.
The first Canadian and first draft choice by a Canadian team, Toronto, in the new Professional Women's Hockey League.
I'm so excited.
Jocelyn Larocque is 35. It's taken an entire generation of players and new investors to launch a women's pro hockey league, including women's rights icon and tennis legend Billie Jean King.
It's not about a single moment. It's about a movement. Finally giving women professional hockey players the platform they deserve, that hockey deserves.
That hockey deserves, a message that the culture of professional hockey is due for change. It comes one day after the NHL saw the embarrassing resignation of Mike Babcock. He was hired by Columbus even after reports he'd mistreated players when he coached in Toronto.
Has the game changed, and have you changed to make it work?
Well, I think it's real important for all of us as people. We got to change every year. We got to grow.
But when a podcast reported he'd asked to see pictures on his new players' phones.
Open up your photos and I want to see who you are as a person.
Babcock was suddenly out.
Now we're seeing more and more players speaking up, rightfully so, and that leads to rightful consequences for the coaches.
Babcock was hired this summer when the NHL announced pride jerseys would no longer be worn by players in pre-game warm-ups to support the LGBTQ+ community, upsetting this former NHLer, himself a target of racism in the NHL.
You look at all the steps taken backwards by the NHL with inclusion nights and stripping people of that 15 minutes of being able to show that it's a welcoming and inclusive space.
So different was the atmosphere around the periwinkle carpet rolled out for the Women's Pro League. The new PWHL will have 6 teams to start, 3 in Canada, 3 in the U.S., and will kick off this January with an initial 24-game regular season.
Women's dreams are going to come true today, and we're going to inspire so many more young girls to play the game, be a part of the game.
A breakthrough not only in women's professional sports, but in hockey for new faces to be seen and voices to be heard. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is the Northern Lights near Calgary, Alberta. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.